I'm not crazy, just committed. You know what I mean? Something first starts out as an idea, then a goal, then before too long it becomes an obsession. Before you know it, the whole thing has gone out of control. That's just the way it goes. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so I'll start where it began. After watching that vile movie, you can already guess the one I mean. It's not like there are many films about two American girls and a Japanese man being soon-assed to mouth by an insane German doctor. I admit, the first time I saw it, I was disgusted by the thought of three humans' bodies being fused into a single digestive system on 12 legs. It wasn't until my third viewing that a voice in my head started quietly whispering to me, "Why can't you do this?" The months dragged on and the idea ate away at me like a cancer. It taunted me, nagged me, and constantly forced its way into my thoughts until the whisper became a scream, clawing in my mind. I could only resist for so long, and I told myself that I would merely humor the idea. My basement walls began to sprout medical diagrams, notes, and theories of what would become my pet creature. After that, the web provided the equipment I would need. I live alone, so there was no one to ask questions. At last, everything was in place. My dingy basement was now stuffed to the gills with surgical equipment, chemicals, and restraints that would put any hospital to shame. I may be a med school dropout, but I know my stuff. Already, this little project of mine has gone further than I ever thought it would. Little did I know how deep this rabbit hole was going to go. Though I may have the means, the voice in my head wouldn't rest. It knew what remained was most pivotal of all. Human bodies. What was I to do? I'm not a monster, you know. It's not as if I could just snatch random people off the street. No, I would have to be selective in who the lucky winners would be. 3 should be enough. No need to be greedy. It took some thought, but I finally decided on who would serve as the head of the Centipede. I gave Ray a smile as he passed my cubicle at work. He raised an eyebrow in response, not able to guess what was going on inside my head. After going over my head for that promotion I needed, he would find out soon enough. Actually, he and I had never gotten along after getting off on the wrong foot. I followed him home one night, tailing him in my Impala. Parking across the street with my headlights off, I waited. He had just slammed the door after exiting his car before I struck, jamming a syringe into his neck and rendering him unconscious. No one dared to see me lower his body into my trunk. I was lucky this time, but would have to be more careful in the future. Ray awoke in my basement a few hours later, already dressed in a hospital gown and strapped securely into a bed. He tried screaming through the gag over his mouth, but it wouldn't do him any good even if I hadn't had the foresight of soundproofing the walls. I just stared at him for a while without saying anything. There was no need to worry him with what was going to happen, at least not right away. My next participant presented itself at the local convenience store. Her name was Judy, you know the type. Pretty in her younger years, but now her face had a permanent scowl alongside a cigarette that seemed to be perpetually in her mouth from behind the cash register. I had been staring at her for too long, sizing her up, before she snapped at me to either buy something or get the hell out. It was that night I ambushed her in the parking lot. With Judy imprisoned in my basement next to Ray, it was time to find the final piece to my creation. I couldn't afford to be too picky since missing persons bulletins were already out. The same voice that had guided me at first seemed to whisper paranoia now. I shifted nervously whenever I passed a cop on the street. I would race to the basement whenever I got home, half expecting to find my volunteers gone. "Spare some change?" asked a voice from below as I walked down the sidewalk. I looked down to see a grizzled, unshaven face of a homeless man, and smiled. With the 3 now at home in my basement, I knew the big moment was near. put on a presentation for them, explaining in detail what was going to happen. Ray's eyes went wider and wider. Judy cried, and the homeless guy I found out was named Lester just seemed resigned to his fate. The surgery went well. My skilled hands deftly wove the thread through their lips and anuses as they lie anesthetized. Their knees would need to be modified in order to suit their new purpose as well. The entire process took 8 hours. I'll never forget my first visit to my new pet after it first woke up. All 3 segments tried aimlessly to free themselves, their cries muffled. Even Ray could only scream when he saw me, his tongue having been removed. He wouldn't eat it anyway, as I prepared nutrient-rich paste to feed the centipede. The gray goo was concentrated enough to satisfy all 3 digestive systems. Judy and Lester would need additional injections to ensure compatibility. Carefully spooning the food into a dog bowl, I placed the container in front of Ray. He just stared at it, as if catatonic. I calmly insisted at first, trying to entice him gently, but eventually lost my patience and gave him a jolt from the electrified cattle prod I acquired. Begrudgingly, he shoveled the food into his mouth with his bare hands. I would be taking notes on future progress. I had to set up a video camera to record my creation while I was at work, which is how I was able to witness its first bowel movement. Everyone there seemed to think Ray had skipped town after incurring gambling debts. I had even been thoughtful enough to leave it some music, puzzles, and toys. I couldn't wait to get home each day to wash, feed, and clean up after my new friend. The centipede stopped resisting feeding time, and in fact eagerly greeted me whenever I entered the basement holding a bucket. Ray eagerly swallowed the mixture now, and the other segments in tow behind them moaning in anticipation. They too seemed to have accepted their situation. In my notes, I recorded it as a case of Stockholm Syndrome. It was a few months later that I started to notice the first physical changes. Though I thought I had to be imagining it at first, the eyes of the centipede had started to turn red. Though not bloodshot, as if on the faintest glow that seemed more obvious in the dark. The movements of the creature no longer seemed clumsy and strained, but coordinated as if the limbs were under the control of a single mind. Finally, the nails and the toes and fingers seemed to grow back thicker and harder no matter how many times I clipped them. More concerningly, my pet was becoming emaciated and slender, regardless of how much gruel I fed it. I attributed the growing paleness of its skin to being confined inside rather than a matter of its diet. Clearly, it was lacking protein. My local butcher was happy to supply me with the surplus marrow and entrails I could use to supplement the centipede's meals. Surely enough, Ray, or whatever used to be Ray, ravenously devoured the red meat I placed before him. The urging voice in my head, strangely enough, had not abated. It instead pleaded to me to nurture my creation and study its progress. At this point, I figured it couldn't hurt. I was kind of past the point of no return now anyway, right? Nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It was late getting off work one night, and I had parked further down the street than usual. I had just walked through the illuminated glow of a streetlight. He accosted me, brandishing a revolver and demanding my wallet. I don't know if it was the stress of the past few months or the sudden surge of adrenaline, but I lunged for the mugger without even thinking about it. Even in the darkness, I could make out the look of surprise as I slammed into him and seized his wrists. I had him in a death grip, my fingernails digging into his skin. As we struggled on the pavement before the deafening report of a gunshot rang out, he fell dead on top of me. A million thoughts ran through my mind as I stood over the criminal's body. The police would be asking questions, I would be detained, and my precious centipede would be neglected, or even discovered. Something had to be done discreetly, I decided. I dumped the corpse into my trunk, as I had done with Ray so many months before. Upon arriving, I lugged him downstairs and undressed him before tossing the cheap clothes into the furnace. no small feat considering he had quite a bit of muscle, much of it covered with tattoos. I hoped the ink wouldn't spoil the plan I had for him. Unlocking the centipede's cage, I hefted the body inside. It had been watching me intently and pounced on the still warm bundle of flesh as soon as it could. I thought what I had witnessed up to that point had hardened me beyond question, but even I had to look away in disgust as it fed on the new meal. I could hear its long nails, now yellowed claws, tear open the mugger's stomach and crunch on strangely sharpened teeth and bones, all accompanied by an obscene slurping clamor. Suppressing the urge to vomit, I made my way upstairs to fetch some cleaning supplies. I found the basement curiously quiet. When I returned, with only a few scraps of flesh and a pool of blood, the only sign the mugger had ever been there. My heart sunk when I didn't see my pet creature. How could it have escaped? I started to panic. As if in response, a noise reverberated from the basement ceiling. I looked up to find it using its many claws to grip the wood overhead, while using raised vocal cords to issue a curious chirping call. Setting down the mop and bleach, I called for it to come down. The look it affixed me with then filled me with nothing short of terror. In a shaky voice, I repeated my command while fumbling for a cattle prod I had left hanging from the wall. With a screech, the centipede leaped from its position, claws outstretched towards me. I rammed my weapon into its pale neck, causing it to hiss from between bared fangs. The sheer force of its attack was enough to make me stumble backwards into the basement's only light switch and plunging the room into darkness. The beast's 6 eyes now fully glowed fiery red like embers in the night. With its newly acquired taste for human flesh, I knew I stood no chance in a fight. I raced back up to the stairs, to the light and away from the darkness of the cold concrete of the basement. I had just cleared the top step and began to slam the door when a clawed hand shot out of the opening and forced it ajar. The centipede's 12 limbs gave it superhuman speed when used in synchronicity. The front door of my house was too far away. I had just enough time to leap behind my kitchen counter and grab a butcher's knife before I heard the ominous clicking from the monster's claws on the tiled floor. The sound came closer and closer until I saw the same pale fingers that had forced the door open next to me around the corner. I plunged the steel blade into the naked flesh as hard as I could, causing the creature to rear back and let loose what I could only describe as a howl so loud I had to cover my ears. The sound still echoed in my head as I dashed for the only other cover I could see, my bathroom. I had just enough time to slam the door and lock it before a great weight slammed into the other side, followed by an angry hiss. I've sat there for hours. The furious clawing has finally stopped, leaving only silence in its place. Has it gone somewhere to find prey, or is it patiently waiting for me to open the door? I'm too scared to look. As for how the centipede became such a monster, I only have theories. That whispering, nagging voice in my head was some kind of demon that needed me to create a vessel for it. Fusing the bodies into one unlocked some kind of hidden, primal hive mind. The injections I've been experimenting with resulted in a mutation. The only thing I know for sure: if you suddenly hear unexplained clicking noises on the floor, walls, or ceiling of your home, don't look. Just run.